Long before the British Empire extended its reach across oceans, the seeds of cruelty were already sown in the streets, prisons, and courtrooms of Britain itself. For centuries, women who defied social expectations, who spoke too loudly, or who dared to step outside the roles carved for them, were branded with punishments that were not simply corrective, but humiliating, designed to remind them of their place. It was here, in the heart of England, that the cultural scripts of discipline were rehearsed, later to be exported and magnified across the empire. One of the most infamous tools of female punishment was the scold's bridle, a grotesque iron cage that encased the head. Its purpose was not to kill, but to silence. Fitted tightly around the skull, its most horrifying feature was a plate or spike inserted into the mouth to press down upon the tongue, often piercing the flesh so that speaking became an agony. Women accused of being scolds, those who quarreled, who gossiped, who spoke out against authority, were forced to wear this contraption in public. They were paraded through marketplaces, jeered at by neighbors, humiliated before entire towns. Their voices were not merely suppressed, they were mutilated. Silence was imposed not only by law, but by pain, a cruel reminder that a woman's words, when unwelcome, could be forcibly erased. The bridle was only one weapon in the arsenal of humiliation. In towns across England and Scotland, women accused of petty offences or moral failings were tied to stocks and pillories, exposed for hours as crowds hurled insults, filth, and sometimes stones. They were stripped, flogged through the streets or branded with hot irons, symbols not only of their supposed sin, but of society's determination to own and define their very bodies. What mattered was not justice, but performance, the public theatre of shame that ensured others would think twice before daring to follow the same path. Perhaps most disturbing was the endurance of these practices. They did not wither away as Britain marched toward empire and modernity. Instead, they lingered in law and custom, mutating into new forms. By the 17th century, as Britain began planting its flag in foreign lands, these punishments became part of the cultural baggage carried abroad. Colonial officers, magistrates, and missionaries absorbed these rituals of discipline, adapting them to alien landscapes and unfamiliar peoples. Women's suffering in Britain had become normalized, even institutionalized, and so it was no great leap for the empire to extend the same cruelty to others, often magnified by the power of conquest. Punishment was more than a reaction to crime. It was a demonstration of power. In Britain itself, public executions, floggings, and humiliations served as moral lessons. But when exported to the colonies, these spectacles became tools of empire, reinforcing the supremacy of British rule. The image of a woman in irons, or flogged before a crowd, sent messages deeper than words could reach. That the empire could penetrate the most intimate realms of life, that even womanhood offered no shield from imperial wrath. The underlying logic was consistent. Women were seen as vessels of order or disorder. In Britain, a wife who defied her husband, or a woman who disrupted the peace, was accused of destabilizing the community. In the colonies, women were cast in the same light, but with the added layers of race, class, and conquest. Their punishment was not only about enforcing discipline, but about cementing hierarchies of man over woman, colonizer over colonized, empire over subject. The punishment of women was not an aberration. It was a deliberate strategy woven into the very structure of power. It is tempting to believe that these punishments belonged only to the lower classes, the impoverished or the criminal. But this was not always the case. Even women of higher social standing were not immune if they stepped too far beyond prescribed boundaries. Aristocratic women might escape the lash of the whip, but they faced social death, exile from polite society, or confinement in private asylums. Respectability itself became a prison where stepping out of line meant ruin. And these ideas of controlling female reputation, sexuality, and obedience would also follow the empire abroad. where British officials sought to regulate not just actions, but entire cultures under the guise of moral reform. The empire, then, was not built upon innovation alone, but upon repetition. The same patterns of humiliation replayed on a grander scale. The stocks and pillories of England found echoes in the flogging posts of Jamaica. The head cages of Scotland gave way to iron collars in the Caribbean, and the silencing of women's voices in Britain became the silencing of entire communities of women across Asia and Africa. What began as local instruments of control were transformed into global instruments of domination. And yet, behind every punishment, there was also resistance. In Britain, women mocked their punishers, whispered stories that outlived the iron bridle, and passed on memories of injustice. They carried this resilience like a hidden flame, one that would later flicker across the empire as colonized women too found ways to endure and to resist. The story of these punishments, then, is not only about cruelty, but about the enduring tension between silence and defiance, between humiliation imposed and dignity reclaimed. As the British Empire began to spread its wings across oceans, the stage was set for punishments more brutal, more degrading, and more systematically enforced than anything seen at home. The cruelty that had once been local would become imperial, etched into plantations, prisons, and colonial courts. And at the center of this machinery of suffering stood women, enslaved, colonized, silenced, yet never entirely erased. The plantations of the Caribbean were among the darkest laboratories of punishment the British Empire ever devised. Here, on islands drenched with sugarcane and stained with blood, enslaved African women bore the brunt of punishments that combined physical cruelty with deliberate humiliation. For the British planters who ruled these estates, punishment was not merely a response to defiance, it was a system, a ritual, a performance of power designed to crush both body and spirit. From dawn until dusk, women labored under the burning sun, cutting cane, hauling loads, or working in boiling houses where sugar was refined. But the labor itself was not the end of their suffering. Should a woman falter, should she resist or simply displease an overseer, the lash awaited her. The whip was perhaps the most feared instrument on the plantations, a weapon that turned human skin into a canvas of pain. Women were tied to whipping posts, their clothes stripped away to expose their bodies before the gaze of others. The lash tore into flesh, but it also tore into dignity, for the spectacle was as important as the suffering. Others were made to watch, sometimes their children, sometimes their fellow laborers, ensuring that the lesson of terror was seared into every heart. There was a grotesque logic to this cruelty. Planters knew that public flogging of women carried symbolic weight. In many African cultures, women held respected roles as mothers, healers, and keepers of community. By flogging a mother before her children, the empire struck at more than flesh. It sought to shatter the bonds of kinship, replacing them with bonds of fear. In this way, punishment became an act of cultural warfare, targeting not only individuals, but the very idea of family and community. The punishments did not stop at the whip. Iron collars and chains were forced around women's necks, their heavy weight a constant reminder of subjugation. Some collars bore projecting prongs or bells, making even rest impossible. A woman forced to wear such a device was marked as disobedient, reduced to a spectacle of degradation. Others were fitted with leg irons, limiting their movement, ensuring that every step was a reminder of their captivity. These punishments turned women's bodies into living prisons, their every breath regulated by the empire's instruments of control. Pregnant women were not spared. Some accounts describe grotesque adaptations of punishment to accommodate pregnancy. A woman about to be flogged might be forced to lie face down in a pit, her belly protected while her back was lashed raw. The supposed mercy of sparing the unborn child only underscored the cruelty of the act, for it meant that the mother's suffering was deemed expendable, even while the child within her was seen as potential property for the plantation's future. The empire's punishments, therefore, stretched across generations, etching pain into the very origins of life. But the humiliation did not end with instruments of torture. Women accused of theft, disobedience, or defiance could be forced to endure punishments of exposure, paraded through villages or plantations, sometimes with signs declaring their crimes, their heads shaved to strip them of honor. In some cases, they were forced to wear degrading garments, symbols of shame that marked them out as examples. These rituals of degradation turned punishment into theater, with the community cast as audience, the woman cast as both victim and warning. The sexualized nature of these punishments was impossible to ignore. Enslaved women were often stripped naked before the lash, their bodies exposed to the gaze of men who claimed mastery over them. Punishment blurred into violation and violation into punishment, creating a cycle of degradation where the female body was not only disciplined but desecrated. Sexual assault itself often functioned as an unspoken form of punishment, meted out by overseers and masters who justified their actions as rights of ownership. The empire cloaked this horror in silence, but the women themselves carried its scars, both physical and unseen. The Caribbean plantations became spaces where the British Empire perfected the art of punishment as spectacle. Every lash, every collar, every act of degradation was a message, not only to the woman who endured it but to all who saw. These punishments were not meant to correct behavior alone. They were meant to enforce the architecture of slavery itself, ensuring that no one could forget their place. And in this architecture, women bore the heaviest weight, for they carried not only their own pain, but the burden of passing it to the next generation under the shadow of empire. Yet even in these crucibles of cruelty, women resisted. Some fought back against overseers, some plotted escapes, others sang songs that preserved memory and dignity in the face of degradation. Their very survival was an act of defiance, for to endure was to deny the empire the complete erasure of humanity it sought. The punishments may have been designed to destroy, but the resilience of those who endured ensured that the memory of suffering was never lost. The story of the Caribbean plantations is not only a story of sugar and wealth, but of flesh torn and dignity stolen, of women turned into symbols of domination by an empire that celebrated civility while practicing barbarity. These punishments, disgusting in their cruelty, reveal the true cost of empire, not in gold or power, but in the lives of women whose pain was written out of the official records, yet remains etched in the hidden history of human endurance. As the British Empire shifted its gaze toward the vast expanse of India, the same logic of punishment traveled with it, reshaped by new laws, new cultures, and new forms of control. And once again, it was women who found themselves at the center of a machinery of humiliation designed to enforce obedience through suffering. When the British Empire extended its dominion into the Indian subcontinent, it encountered a world with its own ancient traditions of justice, morality, and punishment. Yet instead of merely observing, the empire bent these traditions to its own will, weaving British law with colonial authority in ways that deepened cruelty and magnified humiliation. Women in India found themselves caught between systems, between patriarchal norms already entrenched in society and the cold machinery of empire, which added its own layers of punishment and control. Public flogging became a favorite tool of the colonial courts. Women accused of petty theft, disorderly conduct, or defiance of imperial officers were dragged into open spaces, tied to posts, and lashed before crowds. The crack of the whip was not just pain, it was spectacle. The British authorities insisted on witnesses, ensuring that each punishment became a performance of authority. To be flogged was not only to suffer agony, but to be stripped of dignity in front of family, neighbors, and strangers alike. These whippings often took place in marketplaces or village centers, places where life thrived, so that the memory of the punishment would linger like a shadow over daily existence. For women accused of resisting British rule, punishments grew harsher still. During uprisings such as the Rebellion of 1857, women suspected of aiding rebels, whether by carrying messages, hiding fugitives, or even offering food, faced public humiliations and physical torment. Soldiers dragged them through villages, cut their hair, or forced them to carry heavy loads before jeering crowds. Some were whipped not only for their own actions, but as proxies, punished in place of male relatives who had fled. This collective punishment turned women into vessels of retribution, their suffering meant to break the spirit of entire communities. But the empire's reach went beyond the lash. It extended into the intimate spaces of women's lives, particularly through the obsession with regulating sexuality. The Contagious Diseases Acts, imposed in Britain and its colonies alike, created one of the most invasive and degrading punishments of the era. Women suspected of prostitution, often simply poor women loitering near military cantonments, were seized by police, examined against their will for venereal disease, and confined in lock hospitals if found infected. These medical inspections, carried out with crude instruments and brutal indifference, were less about health than about control. Women were treated as contaminated objects, their bodies invaded in the name of protecting British soldiers. To be subjected to such an examination was itself a punishment, a state-sanctioned violation that stripped away dignity and autonomy. The empire's legal structures also reinforced older forms of female suffering, cloaking them in the authority of British rule. Widowhood, for instance, had long carried stigma in many Indian communities, but under colonial administration, the hardships faced by widows often deepened. Property laws and inheritance practices, manipulated by British courts, left countless widows impoverished and vulnerable. Some were driven into prostitution or forced labor, their poverty itself functioning as a silent punishment for existing outside the sanctity of marriage. While the empire condemned certain practices such as sati, it simultaneously allowed others forms of oppression to thrive, punishing women not by fire but by abandonment and destitution. The prison system too became a site of female degradation. Women incarcerated for crimes, whether petty theft, rebellion, or supposed immorality, were subjected to harsh regimes of labor. They were forced to spin cotton, weave cloth, or break stones under grueling conditions, often shackled and deprived of adequate food or rest. In some prisons, women were kept in isolation, cut off from children and families, their punishment magnified by the severing of bonds that gave life meaning. In others, they endured abuse at the hands of wardens, the boundaries between punishment and exploitation blurred by unchecked power. The empire's obsession with order meant that even the most personal acts could draw punishment. Women who protested taxes, who joined in boycotts, or who simply raised their voices against unfair treatment found themselves targeted. British officers feared women's ability to inspire communities, to fuel resistance through songs, prayers, or gatherings, and so punishments were crafted to silence not only the body, but the spirit, to transform symbols of defiance into warnings. In villages where women had sung songs of rebellion, they might later be forced into degrading labor, their voices replaced with silence and shame. What makes these punishments particularly grotesque is the way they were justified. British officials framed them as acts of civilization, claiming that discipline would elevate backward peoples into modernity. The lash was recast as instruction, the prison as reform, the invasive examination as medical necessity. Cloaked in the rhetoric of progress, the empire's punishments were defended as benevolent, even as they carved humiliation deep into the lives of women. It was hypocrisy of the highest order, a mask of morality worn over the face of cruelty. And yet, even in the shadow of such punishments, women found ways to resist. Some refused to submit to examinations, even when forced. Others smuggled food to rebels, carried secret messages, or maintained traditions that defied imperial order. Stories of women's defiance circulated in whispers, fueling the fire of resistance across generations. The punishments were meant to destroy dignity, but in enduring them, women sometimes transformed their suffering into a form of silent defiance, proof that the empire could wound but not erase them. The British Empire in India revealed the true duality of punishment. It was at once intimate and public, invasive and spectacular, cloaked in civility yet dripping with barbarity. For women, this duality was a trap from which there was little escape. To resist was to invite punishment. To submit was to live under its shadow. And so the empire's cruelty thrived, embedded in daily life, shaping generations of women whose suffering was rarely recorded, but whose endurance told its own story. As the empire turned its gaze once more toward the British Isles, the same obsessions with morality and control resurfaced at home, exposing women to punishments that revealed the deep anxieties of a society desperate to police their bodies and voices. The empire may have stretched across oceans, but the same impulse to punish and humiliate women festered within Britain's own borders. For all the talk of civilization, morality and virtue, the British state turned cruelty inward, using women's bodies as battlegrounds upon which order and reputation were defended. In many ways, the punishments inflicted at home laid bare the hypocrisies of an empire that claimed to bring enlightenment to the world while shrouding its own streets and prisons in darkness. Nowhere was this clearer than in the treatment of women accused of prostitution. Victorian Britain was obsessed with morality, and at the heart of this obsession lay an anxiety about female sexuality. The streets of London, Liverpool, and other cities teemed with working-class women who, driven by poverty, sometimes turned to sex work to survive. Yet society did not treat them with pity or understanding. Instead, they were branded as corrupters of men, as vectors of disease, as creatures whose very existence threatened the moral fabric of the nation. The Contagious Diseases Acts, introduced in the mid-19th century, revealed this obsession in its most grotesque form. Ostensibly designed to curb the spread of venereal disease among soldiers and sailors, these laws targeted women with invasive cruelty. Police officers were empowered to seize any woman merely suspected of prostitution. These women were dragged to police stations, often without trial or proper evidence, and subjected to compulsory medical examinations. The instruments used were crude, the procedures rough and degrading. Many women described the experience as a form of assault, their bodies invaded by the state under the guise of medicine. Those found to be infected were confined to lock hospitals, imprisoned not for crimes but for their bodies. The humiliation was double-edged. On the one hand, women endured the shame of exposure, dragged through the streets and branded as diseased. On the other, they suffered the violation of forced examination, their dignity stripped in rooms where compassion was absent. Men, of course, were never subjected to such indignities. Soldiers and sailors who carried disease roamed freely, while women bore the punishment for the supposed sins of both genders. The law itself became a form of institutionalized misogyny, embedding the idea that women's bodies existed to be regulated, policed, and punished. Prisons, too, became sites of female degradation. Women convicted of petty theft, drunkenness, or prostitution were sentenced to hard labor. They broke stones, picked oakum, or worked at spinning wheels in cold, damp conditions that eroded their health. Silence was often enforced. Women were forbidden to speak, their days reduced to monotonous toil punctuated by the bark of wardens. For those who disobeyed, punishments ranged from solitary confinement to the lash, a brutal relic still lingering in institutions that claimed to reform rather than torment. Yet the punishments inflicted upon women extended beyond the prison walls. Public shaming remained a potent weapon. Women suspected of immorality could be expelled from their communities, their reputations destroyed by whispers as damaging as any lash. Employers dismissed them, neighbors shunned them, and families disowned them, creating a form of social punishment as devastating as physical pain. In towns and villages, a woman's honor was fragile, and once tarnished, it rarely recovered. The empire thrived on spectacle abroad, but in Britain, the spectacle of punishment was woven into daily life, where gossip and rumor became tools as sharp as iron. Even in the realm of mental health, punishment and control merged in chilling ways. Women deemed unruly, outspoken, or non-conforming could be confined to asylums diagnosed with hysteria or moral insanity. Inside these institutions, they endured isolation, forced treatments, and in some cases, physical restraints. Many were not mad at all. They were inconvenient. Wives who resisted husbands, daughters who disobeyed fathers, women who defied societal expectations. Their confinement was itself a punishment, cloaked in the language of care, but functioning as a prison for the disobedient. What ties these practices together is not merely cruelty, but hypocrisy. Britain presented itself as a beacon of progress, a land of law and liberty. Yet within its cities, women were stripped, examined, confined, and humiliated by the very institutions that proclaimed themselves civilized. The empire claimed to uplift backward peoples abroad while reducing its own women to objects of control. Punishment became a mirror, reflecting the anxieties of a society desperate to police female behavior, yet unwilling to admit its own brutality. But resistance stirred even here. Women's voices rose against the Contagious Diseases Acts, led by campaigners such as Josephine Butler, who denounced the laws as state-sanctioned violation. These campaigns exposed the cruelty of the system and eventually forced its repeal, proving that even in the heart of empire, women could challenge the machinery of humiliation. Their struggle, however, was a reminder of how deeply punishment was woven into the empire's fabric, for every small victory revealed countless silent sufferings that would never be erased. The punishments inflicted upon women in Britain were not isolated from the empire, but echoed across it, part of a shared logic of control that tied together London, Calcutta, Kingston, and Nairobi. The same impulses that drove women into prisons and asylums at home fueled the lash on plantations and the humiliations in colonial villages. The empire was not two stories, one of glory abroad and one of repression at home, but a single story of power maintained through suffering. As the British Empire expanded further into Africa, these patterns of punishment hardened, adapted to new landscapes and new resistances. There, in the heat of colonial uprisings, the degradation of women reached new depths as punishments became tools of warfare against entire communities. Africa became another vast theater for the empire's obsession with discipline. From the gold mines of South Africa to the fertile highlands of Kenya, the British sought to break resistance not only with guns and prisons, but through punishments designed to leave scars both visible and invisible. Women, as carriers of culture and community, were often singled out for degradation. Their bodies turned into battlegrounds where the empire's power could be etched in flesh. In Kenya, during the Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s, women suspected of aiding rebels were dragged from their homes and subjected to punishments that shocked even some of the colonial officers themselves. Public floggings were carried out with deliberate ceremony, overseen by administrators who framed them as lawful measures of discipline. But these were not simply judicial acts, they were performances of domination. Women were forced to kneel in the dirt, stripped of clothing, beaten before their children, husbands, and neighbors. The whip cracked not only against their skin, but against the collective spirit of the community. For colonial power, the message was clear. Resistance would bring not just death, but dishonor. Collective punishment became a hallmark of British control. Entire villages suspected of sheltering rebels were rounded up, and women bore the brunt of the reprisals. Some were forced to carry heavy loads of wood or stones for miles under armed guard, collapsing in exhaustion while soldiers mocked their suffering. Others were made to crawl on their knees through the dust, their humiliation staged as an example to all who watched. It was not enough to punish individuals. The empire sought to punish symbols. Women, as mothers, wives, and keepers of tradition, embodied those symbols, and so their suffering carried a weight that punishment of men alone could never achieve. In detention camps, the line between punishment and torture blurred. Women suspected of withholding information were beaten, starved, or forced into degrading positions for hours on end. Some accounts speak of sexual assault used as a weapon, cloaked in silence but whispered about by survivors, whose voices reached beyond the walls of confinement. The empire cloaked these practices in bureaucratic language, calling them interrogations. But the reality was punishment carried to its most intimate and revolting extremes. South Africa, too, bore witness to this machinery of degradation. During periods of unrest, British authorities enforced curfews and passed laws targeting women who resisted. Punishments included imprisonment in overcrowded cells, forced labor on municipal projects, and public beatings. Women who refused to carry the hated pass documents, symbols of racial control, were dragged before magistrates and fined sums they could not pay, leading to further imprisonment. Here, punishment was not only physical but economic, designed to impoverish families and communities through the suffering of women. Beyond formal uprisings, ordinary acts of defiance were also met with cruelty. A woman accused of harboring fugitives or hiding weapons could be tied to a tree and whipped while soldiers laughed. Others were forced to stand in the sun for hours, water withheld, their exhaustion and thirst treated as entertainment. In some villages, women were made to dance or sing degrading songs under duress, their humiliation turned into a grotesque parody of festivity. These rituals of shame stripped women of dignity, reducing them to spectacles of suffering that reinforced the empire's authority. What made these punishments particularly disgusting was their calculated intimacy. The empire knew that striking women struck at the very heart of a society. In many African cultures, women were not passive figures, but active custodians of memory, tradition, and survival. To degrade them was to wound the spirit of an entire people. Colonial officers understood this and wielded it as a weapon. They believed that through the suffering of women, entire communities could be subdued, their resistance broken not by the battlefield, but by the sight of mothers and wives in chains, beaten, silenced, dishonored. And yet, these acts of cruelty often backfired. Women became central figures in resistance movements precisely because they endured such punishments. In Kenya, women smuggled food and messages to rebels, carried weapons beneath their garments, and continued to sing forbidden songs even after being flogged for it. In South Africa, women organized protests against past laws, filling prisons until the system buckled under the strain. Their endurance transformed punishment into defiance, each scar a reminder not of submission, but of survival. Still, the suffering was immense, and the cruelty deliberate. The British Empire justified these punishments as necessary for order, as lawful responses to disorder and rebellion. But in truth, they were tools of terror, designed not to bring justice, but to enforce domination through the most intimate forms of pain. They revealed the empire not as a civilizing force, but as a machine of degradation, willing to strip dignity from the very women who held their societies together. The lash, the chain, the humiliation, they all carried the same message across Africa, that the empire could invade not only lands but lives, not only villages but bodies. And yet, in the resilience of women who endured, the empire faced a silent resistance it could never fully extinguish. As the story of these punishments unfolds, a pattern becomes undeniable. Whether in the Caribbean, India, Africa, or Britain itself, the machinery of empire found in women the most vulnerable targets for its cruelty. Silencing, humiliation, degradation, all were woven into the fabric of imperial control. And in the next chapter, we see how this silencing became more than physical. as the empire refined punishments specifically to suppress the very voices of women who dared to defy. The empire understood that voices could be as dangerous as weapons. A whisper could carry a secret across a prison wall. A song could kindle rebellion in a village. A cry could rally others to defiance. And so the British authorities refined their punishments to silence women, not only by breaking their bodies, but by striking at their voices, their words, and their very ability to speak. The tradition of silencing women through force had deep roots in Britain itself. Long before the empire stretched its reach across continents, women in English towns could be fitted with the scold's bridle, a grotesque metal contraption that locked around the head and forced a spiked plate into the mouth. Officially designed for women accused of gossip or nagging, it was less about morality than it was about fear. Fear of women whose words carried influence, who embarrassed men of power, who dared to protest injustice. The sight of a woman paraded through the streets, gagged by iron, turned into a spectacle of mockery, set a chilling example. To speak too loudly was to invite degradation. When the empire expanded, the same logic traveled with it. In colonies from the Caribbean to India and Africa, women who defied authority were subjected to similar symbolic punishments. While the exact devices of medieval England rarely appeared abroad, the methods of gagging, binding, and humiliation multiplied in new forms. A woman suspected of spreading rumors about rebellion could be bound hand and foot, forced to kneel before soldiers, her mouth stuffed with cloth, her silence enforced not by debate, but by brute restraint. Her community would be forced to watch, the message clear. Words could be crimes. In prisons across the empire, silence became policy. Women held for theft, prostitution, or defiance of colonial laws were confined under systems of absolute silence, forbidden from speaking to one another. Wardens patrolled the corridors, and even the whisper of a name could bring the lash. This was not only about discipline, but about erasing solidarity. To prevent women from organizing, comforting each other, or passing information, the empire enforced silence as a punishment in itself. Weeks of isolation, mouths closed by fear, turned imprisonment into a slow suffocation of the spirit. Chains and shackles were another cruel instrument of silencing. A woman chained in public could not gesture freely, could not express herself without pain. In some colonies, rebels' wives were forced to wear iron collars with bells that rang when they moved, humiliating them with every step. These collars made even the smallest whisper of movement a public announcement, a grotesque parody of freedom. For women, whose voices had already been constrained by gender, such punishments rendered the body itself a prison, each sound of the bell a reminder of subjugation. There were also punishments that blurred the line between labor and silencing. Women condemned for crimes, or simply for defiance, were put to work breaking stones in silence, carrying loads or digging earth for endless hours. Their voices were drowned in the rhythm of forced labor, their exhaustion ensuring they had no strength left for protest. This was a calculated cruelty, to silence not through the gag or the lash alone, but through sheer depletion, reducing women to bodies of labor stripped of speech. Perhaps most insidious of all was the use of shame to enforce silence. Women accused of indecency, prostitution, or disobedience were often stripped and paraded, their humiliation a louder punishment than any whip. To be laughed at, mocked, and jeered silenced many who would otherwise have shouted their defiance. In cultures where women's honor was tied to family and community standing, this kind of punishment was designed to echo long after the moment passed, silencing not only the woman, but those who saw her shame and feared to share it. In India, women who joined protests against colonial taxes or land seizures often found themselves beaten in public squares, the blows falling not only on their bodies but on their reputations. The spectacle silenced others, warning them that resistance would not only bring pain but dishonor. In Africa, women who sang protest songs were singled out, forced into degrading tasks, mocked into silence. In the Caribbean, enslaved women who used chants or coded songs to communicate with one another were punished with lashings meant to terrify others into swallowing their voices. Yet silence was never absolute. The empire's attempts to muzzle women often created deeper forms of resistance. Whispers carried in the dead of night became messages of defiance. Songs banned in public were sung softly in kitchens and fields, their words surviving even when voices were hushed. Women used silence itself as a weapon, refusing to answer interrogators, denying colonizers the satisfaction of hearing cries of pain. In this way, punishment designed to silence often produced a defiance that spoke louder than words. The disgusting ingenuity of these punishments lies not only in their brutality, but in their symbolism. To attack a woman's voice was to attack her personhood, her role as storyteller, teacher, singer, mother, and leader. The empire feared those voices, for they carried memories of resistance, songs of belonging, truths that could not be erased. And so silence became a battlefield, where iron bridles, gags, and isolation fought against whispers, songs, and the unbreakable resilience of women who refused to be muted. As the machinery of punishment ground on, one truth became clear. The silencing of women was not incidental, but central to imperial power. It was not merely about quelling gossip or disorder. It was about denying women the ability to shape narratives, to speak of cruelty, to pass on stories of resistance. For empires are built not only on conquest of land, but on conquest of memory, and women's voices were among the strongest vessels of that memory. From the clang of iron to the enforced hush of prison corridors, the empire perfected the art of silencing. But just as every lash left a scar, every attempt at silence left echoes. These echoes carried forward, whispered from one generation to the next, ensuring that even the most disgusting punishments could not erase truth entirely. And as the empire continued to refine its methods, those echoes became seeds of resistance, small but indestructible. The machinery of punishment was vast, stretching from the smallest village stocks to the grandest colonial prisons. It was not only individuals who were punished, but entire societies. Their values twisted, their women degraded. And so, to understand the empire's cruelty, we must step back and see the whole apparatus, the network of punishments, silences, degradations that formed the machinery of empire itself. The punishments that scarred women across the British Empire were not accidents, nor were they the missteps of a few cruel individuals. They were part of a machinery, deliberate and systematic, a network of laws, customs, and spectacles that together ensured domination. To understand their full weight, one must see them not as scattered moments of cruelty, but as gears in the vast apparatus of imperial control. Every empire has its theater of power, and the British Empire was no exception. Punishment became performance, carefully staged to display authority and terrorize those who watched. A woman whipped in a plantation yard, a prisoner gagged in an English town square, an Indian widow dragged before colonial officers. Each was a piece of theater designed not just for the victim, but for the audience. The lash, the chain, the humiliation were amplified by sight, by sound, by memory. They became lessons etched into the minds of communities, ensuring that even those untouched by the whip carried its fear in their bones. Law became the scaffolding of this machinery. Statutes passed in Parliament or drafted by colonial governors framed punishments as justice, as order, as civilization itself. The Contagious Diseases Acts, for instance, justified the medical violation of women in Britain as protection of the armed forces, reducing their suffering to a footnote in the larger cause of empire. In India, ordinances gave police powers to flog women accused of disorder or defiance, embedding cruelty in the very language of governance. Punishment was not a breakdown of law, but its enactment, its visible arm extended into women's lives. Bureaucracy gave the machine its gears. Reports of floggings, of inspections, of imprisonments were filed, stamped, and archived. In the paperwork of empire, human suffering was flattened into numbers, into statistics of discipline. A woman's body became a case file, her humiliation translated into the cold ink of administrative notes. This bureaucratic distance allowed cruelty to expand without conscience, for the pain of women was processed as data, their cries lost in the shuffle of reports. But the machinery was not only legal or administrative, it was cultural. Punishment became a spectacle woven into the rituals of empire. Public humiliations drew crowds, villagers forced to witness a neighbor whipped or paraded. Children grew up watching these punishments, absorbing the lesson that authority was absolute, and that resistance, especially among women, brought degradation. These were rituals of power, repeated across continents, carried out with the same grim efficiency, whether in the streets of London or the fields of Jamaica. Economics gave the machine its fuel. Forced labor was not only punishment, but profit. Women sentenced to plantations, prisons, or road crews contributed to the wealth of the empire, even as they suffered. Their silence enriched overseers, their exhaustion built roads, their humiliation filled the coffers of imperial authorities. The empire turned punishment into productivity, cruelty into capital, ensuring that even the suffering of women became a resource to be exploited. Religion lent its shadow as well. Missionaries and moralists often framed women's punishments as necessary correction, cloaking degradation in the language of salvation. A flogging became a lesson in obedience, imprisonment, a chance for moral reform. Even the most revolting acts could be justified when wrapped in scripture, when presented as the cleansing of sin rather than the exercise of control. In this way, spiritual authority reinforced political power, and women were caught between the whip of the state and the sermon of the pulpit. Yet the most disgusting feature of this machinery was its hypocrisy. While the empire proclaimed itself a bringer of civilization, enlightenment, and progress, it built its order on the degradation of women. It boasted of law while wielding the lash, of morality while parading naked prisoners, of justice while silencing voices. The empire's punishments reveal its true face, not the polished mask of civilization, but the iron jaws of domination. This machinery did not simply operate in the colonies and fade away. Its echoes returned to Britain itself. The same logic that flogged women in Kenya enforced silence in English prisons. The same mindset that paraded enslaved women in the Caribbean enforced medical inspections of prostitutes in London. The empire was not an export, but a mirror, and its punishments reflected back into the heart of Britain, binding colonizer and colonized alike in the same machinery of cruelty. Still, even the most powerful machine cannot silence resistance forever. Women endured, adapted, and fought back. Some resisted in silence, refusing to cry out under the lash. Others whispered songs, smuggled messages, or passed down stories that preserved memory in defiance of erasure. Their resilience clogged the gears of the empire's machinery, reminding it that domination could never be total. Every scar, every silence, every whisper became part of a counter-narrative, one that outlasted the empire itself. In the end, the machinery of empire was vast, efficient, and cruel. But it was not eternal. The very women it sought to break became its undoing, their resistance small but cumulative, their memory unyielding. And as the machinery faltered, as the empire began to crumble, those women's stories emerged from silence, demanding to be heard. Yet the question remains, what is left behind when the machine collapses? The punishments did not vanish with the empire. Their legacy lingers in scars, in memories, in social structures that still carry echoes of humiliation and control. To see that legacy, we must look to the women who carried it, who resisted it, who turned even silence into defiance. And so we turn to the final chapter, where the echoes of punishment meet the voices of resistance, and the darkest truths give way to the unbreakable endurance of those who survived. Even as the British Empire spread its iron grip across continents, even as women were paraded, flogged, shackled, gagged, or forced into exile, the human spirit found ways to endure. Across oceans, languages, and generations, women turned suffering into resistance, humiliation into memory, silence into defiance. Their endurance became a thread weaving together the darkest chapters of empire, a quiet yet indomitable form of rebellion. In the Caribbean, enslaved women whispered secrets through songs in the cane fields, coded messages carried from one laborer to another. The lash could break flesh but not spirit. Mothers passed down survival strategies to daughters, teaching them how to endure without surrendering entirely to fear. Their resilience transformed punishment into a form of storytelling, preserving histories the empire sought to erase. In India, women subjected to floggings, humiliating examinations, and public shame discovered forms of agency within oppression. Secret networks of support flourished. Songs of defiance echoed quietly in kitchens and courtyards, and clandestine acts of rebellion, smuggling food, sheltering fugitives, speaking truth to colonial officers, carved spaces of autonomy within the machinery of control. Even in silence, women's voices carried forward, leaving traces that would later ripple through movements of independence and reform. In Africa, from Kenya to South Africa, women endured the lash, the chain, and the humiliation of public spectacles. Yet they remained central to the survival of communities under siege. They smuggled information, provided nourishment and care for rebels, and organized acts of resistance that defied the empire's calculations. Every forced march, every whipping, every attempt at silencing only reinforced their importance as carriers of memory and guardians of culture. The empire could degrade them, but it could not erase them. Even in Britain itself, women challenged the structures of degradation. Activists rose against laws that violated their bodies. Campaigns like those against the Contagious Diseases Acts forced authorities to reckon with institutionalized cruelty. Women who were silenced in prisons, confined in asylums, or paraded through public squares found collective strength in solidarity, proving that resistance could exist within the very heart of oppression. Their courage sent ripples through the empire, showing that defiance could travel alongside cruelty. The punishments of the British Empire were as varied as they were cruel, from the grotesque spectacle of the scold's bridle to the systematic humiliation of colonial labor, from invasive medical examinations to the carefully staged horrors of public floggings. Each act of degradation served a purpose: to maintain authority, enforce obedience, and normalize domination. Yet for every act of cruelty, there was an act of endurance. The machinery of the empire may have sought to reduce women to objects of humiliation, but in surviving, resisting, and remembering, they claimed an invisible victory. History often reduces these women to statistics, footnotes, or anonymous names in reports. But their experiences, their pain, and their defiance form a narrative far more vivid and enduring than any official record. They remind us that even in the face of the most disgusting punishments designed to erase humanity, human resilience persists. They endured, they resisted, and they ensured that the memory of cruelty would not disappear quietly into the past. To witness this history is to confront uncomfortable truths: that empires often hide their brutality behind claims of civilization, that punishment can be a tool of domination, and that women have historically borne the heaviest weight of these violences. Yet it is also to see the power of endurance, the quiet heroism of those who survived, and the way memory can outlast oppression. As we reflect on these stories, it becomes clear that the legacy of these punishments is not confined to the past. It echoes in contemporary struggles for gender justice, in movements demanding bodily autonomy, and in communities working to reclaim histories that were once silenced. The women of the British Empire endured horrors that defy comprehension, yet their resistance continues to teach and inspire, reminding us that no machine of cruelty is ever absolute, and no voice, no matter how silenced, can ever be entirely extinguished. And so the story ends, not with the empire, but with the women who outlasted it, bearing scars, carrying memories, and passing down resilience across generations. Their endurance is the true monument of history, far more enduring than any crown, colony, or throne. In their silence there was strength, in their humiliation, courage, and in their survival, an unbreakable testament to the human spirit.